How does a man with no formal education and a meager salary of $200 a year become the voice that mobilized a generation for the ends of the earth? In 1858, John Paton provided the answer, not with a speech, but with a shovel. Standing on the volcanic ash of a remote Pacific island, he dug a grave for his wife and newborn son, a moment of staggering loss that should have ended his mission. Yet, it was in this very soil of personal tragedy that Paton's resolve was buried and reborn. His life serves as a startling testament to what happens when a human spirit refuses to break, proving that the most enduring harvests are often those sown in the deepest sorrow. The history of 19th century missions is often told through the lens of triumphant expansion, yet the life of John Paton reveals a life etched in the grit of profound suffering and the quiet tenacity of faith. Paton did not emerge as a missionary hero from a vacuum of ease. Rather, his eventual impact on the South Pacific was the harvest of a life tilled in the rocky soil of Scottish poverty and urban squalor. His story serves as a quintessential study in costly obedience, where the mandate to carry the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth was weighed against the very real prospect of martyrdom and the devastating reality of personal loss. Paton's legacy is not merely defined by the geographical distance he traveled from the rolling hills of Dumfries to the volcanic shores of the New Hebrides, but by the spiritual distance he bridged between disparate worlds. He stood as a mediator between the Victorian religious fervor of the West and the unreached tribal societies of the Pacific, often finding himself caught in the crossfire of colonial exploitation and indigenous resistance. To understand Paton is to understand a man for whom the fellowship of Christ was not a theological abstraction, but a literal, life-sustaining presence that stood between him and the abyss of despair during his darkest hours. His life begins not with a sudden burst of zeal, but with a rigorous, decade-long apprenticeship in the shadows of industrial Glasgow, where his character was forged for the fires to come. The foundation of John Paton's missionary resolve was laid long before he set foot on a vessel bound for the South Seas. Born near Dumfries, Scotland, in 1824, Paton's early years were characterized by the meager circumstances of a working-class family, where formal education was a luxury often sacrificed to the necessity of labor. However, this lack of traditional schooling did not result in a poverty of the mind or spirit. Instead, it cultivated a pragmatic resilience. By the time he reached his early 20s, Paton had already developed a profound spiritual conviction that demanded expression through service. This inner drive led him to the Glasgow City Mission in 1847, a transition that would serve as his pioneer ground and his most vital training environment. The Glasgow of the mid-19th century was a stark landscape of industrial upheaval, where the rapid influx of workers had created pockets of extreme destitution. Paton was appointed to the Green Street of Calton, a district notorious for its volatility and spiritual neglect. The environment was one of unoccupied territory in a religious sense. It was a place where the organized church had largely failed to penetrate. In this lowest district, Paton encountered a population where drunkenness, blasphemy, and open vice were not merely present, but ran riot. It was here that Paton learned the art of the house-to-house visit, a method of radical proximity that required him to converse with every person regarding eternal things. This work was grueling and financially precarious. Paton's annual salary was less than $200, a sum that underscored the sacrificial nature of his vocation even before he left Scottish soil. The challenge was not merely the poverty of the residents, but their entrenched alienation from the Christian faith. He discovered lapsed church members who had not crossed the threshold of a sanctuary in 20 years, living in a vacuum where the only religious presence was an ignorant and superstitious form of Romanism that offered no barrier against the prevailing social decay. Paton's response to this misery was twofold: intensive personal contact and the formation of small spiritual nuclei. He spent 4 hours every day in the tenements, building relationships through personal sympathetic contact. He recognized that the vastness of the social problem required a localized, intimate solution. By establishing little prayer circles and evening meetings, He provided a communal structure for those seeking relief from the misery of soul and body. This period was his apprenticeship in cultural bridge building, learning to speak the language of the broken and the skeptical. During these 10 years in Glasgow, from 1847 to 1856, Paton was also engaged in an intellectual and professional duality. While he spent his days in the slums, he spent his nights and remaining hours undertaking rigorous studies in medicine and divinity. This was a calculated preparation. He understood that the mission field required a whole man approach. The ability to heal the body was as essential as the ability to minister to the soul. His education was not for the sake of status, but for utility in the face of the incredible privations he anticipated. The culmination of this long season of preparation came in 1858. Having been ordained by the Reformed Presbyterian Church, Paton finally answered the call that had been maturing within him for over a decade. He was no longer the uneducated youth from Dumfries. He was a seasoned urban missionary, a trained medic, and a disciplined theologian. When he turned his gaze toward the new Hebrides island of Tanna, he did so with a character already hardened by the variety of rascality he had witnessed in the streets of Glasgow. The transition from the worst respect pioneer ground of the city to the literal frontier of the Pacific was, for Paton, the logical next step in a life already surrendered to a singular, demanding purpose. The transition from the industrial slums of Glasgow to the volcanic shores of Tanna was a shift from one form of frontier to another. Yet the stakes in the South Pacific were immediately more lethal. When Paton arrived at Antium on August 30th, 1858, alongside his wife, Mary Ann, he carried with him the conviction that the gospel could tame even the most volatile social environments. However, the new Hebrides presented a complex tapestry of hostility that combined indigenous resistance with the predatory behavior of wicked sandalwood traders. This was a landscape where the white man was often viewed through the lens of colonial exploitation, a prejudice exacerbated when traders deliberately infected the local population with measles to seize their land. The intellectual preparation Paton had undertaken in Scotland was immediately put to the test by a sequence of devastating personal tragedies. Within the first year of their arrival, Mary Ann gave birth to a son, but the joy of new life was ephemeral. Both mother and child died shortly thereafter due to complications from childbirth and the harsh tropical environment. This period represented the absolute nadir of Paton's emotional life. Deprived of any human comfort in a land that viewed him with suspicion, he was forced to perform the most agonizing of duties, digging the graves for his own wife and infant. This lonely grave became a pivotal site in missionary history. Paton later confessed that without a tangible sense of the fellowship of Jesus, the weight of his grief would have resulted in madness or death beside those graves. Instead, the crisis served to distill his faith. The grace he received during this bereavement was not a passive comfort, but a functional resilience that allowed him to continue his labor among the Tannese for 3.5 more years. During this time, he endured every variety of rascality and treachery, navigating a social climate where his message was rejected and his very presence was a target for aggression. By 1862, the situation on Tanna had reached a breaking point. Hostility from the local tribes, fueled by the sickness and death they associated with the presence of Europeans, forced a harrowing evacuation. Paton escaped the island with nothing but the clothes on his back. To an outside observer, the Tanna mission was an unmitigated failure. He left behind 2 graves and not a single reliable convert. Yet this period of unsuccessful labor was the crucible that established his authority as a witness of suffering, a credential that would later mobilize an entire generation of supporters in the West. The narrative of Paton's survival on Tanna and later islands is punctuated by episodes that he categorized as nothing less than supernatural intervention. His experience was defined by a constant proximity to death, where the providence of his survival became a central theme of his later advocacy. On one occasion, Paton and his wife found their mission headquarters surrounded by hostile tribesmen intent on burning the building and killing its occupants. They spent a terror-filled night in prayer, only to find the attackers inexplicably departing at dawn. The resolution of this mystery came a year later when a converted chief revealed that the warriors had seen hundreds of big men in shining garments with drawn swords encircling the station. For Paton, this was not a hallucination of the natives, but a literal fulfillment of divine protection through angels. Such incidents were frequent. He was once followed for hours by a chief with a loaded gun. Paton responded by quietly going about his work as if the threat were non-existent, a psychological and spiritual stance that seemed to paralyze his would-be assassin. Perhaps the most evocative image of this spiritual sustenance is Paton hiding in a tree while a mob sought his life below. In the darkness, surrounded by those who wished to kill him, he recorded a profound sense of peace, claiming he felt safe in the arms of Jesus. These experiences transformed his theology from a set of practiced doctrines into a lived reality. He began to view the danger of death not as an obstacle to his work, but as the very condition that allowed for a deeper consciousness of the Lord's presence. Each deliverance acted as a reinforcement of his resolve, convincing him that he was immortal until his work was done. This internal fortification allowed him to maintain a posture of sustained commitment, even when the outward circumstances suggested that his efforts were in vain. The forced evacuation from Tanna in 1862 was a tactical retreat that could have signaled the end of Paton's missionary career. Instead, it shifted his theater of operation from the volcanic soil of the Pacific to the pulpits of the West. Paton recognized that the survival of the New Hebrides mission depended on a drastic increase in both human and financial capital. He leveraged his harrowing experiences, the loss of his family, the constant threats of violence, and the treachery of white traders, not for self-pity, but as a riveting testimony to mobilize the global church. Traveling extensively through Australia and New Zealand, Paton successfully aroused a sleeping interest in the spiritual state of the islands. His approach was not that of a distant bureaucrat, but of a seasoned soldier reporting from the front lines. This period of advocacy was characterized by a relentless recruitment drive. In 1864, while serving as the moderator for his church in Scotland, he successfully recruited 7 new missionaries to return with him. This was a testament to his persuasion. He did not merely ask for funds, he asked for lives. He secured the mission's future not only through personnel, but by marrying Margaret Whitecross before returning to the field in 1865, ensuring he did not return to the islands alone. In 1866, Paton settled on the island of Aniwa, a location near Tanna that would become the site of his most profound spiritual victory. This 15-year tenure served as the practical demonstration of the skills he had honed in Glasgow. Unlike the volatile rejection he faced on Tanna, the work on Aniwa was characterized by a patient, holistic transformation of the entire social fabric. The methodology Paton employed on Aniwa was three-dimensional. First, he focused on the intellectual and spiritual infrastructure by translating significant portions of the scriptures into the native Aniwan tongue. This provided the people with a permanent foundation in their own language, removing the missionary as the sole mediator of truth. Second, he prioritized leadership development, cultivating efficient native helpers like Lomai, who evolved from a curious student into a powerful indigenous evangelist. Third, he addressed the physical and social needs of the community, utilizing his medical training to heal and his diplomatic skills to mediate tribal peace. By the end of his labor there, the majority of the inhabitants professed Christianity, turning the island into a beacon of stability in a turbulent region. The success on Aniwa eventually circled back to the site of his initial heartache. Years after Paton's departure, the believers from Aniwa sent their own mission to Tanna, resulting in a harvest of conversions on the very ground that Paton had once sown with the tears of bereavement. It was the ultimate validation of his belief that no gospel effort, however fraught with tragedy, is ever truly wasted. The final decades of John Paton's life saw him transition from a local missionary to a global icon of the evangelical movement. After leaving Aniwa in 1881, his influence expanded through 2 primary channels: his physical presence on the global speaking circuit and the publication of his autobiography. Paton did not view his departure from the islands as a retirement, but as a strategic shift to provide a voice for those who remained in the shadow of death. In 1889, the publication of missionary patriarch and anthropologist and his subsequent popular autobiographies acted as a catalyst for a renewed interest in world missions. His writing was marked by a lack of Victorian sentimentality. Instead, it offered a gritty, visceral account of life on the edge of civilization. He detailed the variety of rascality he encountered not to shock his readers, but to demonstrate the transformative power of the gospel in the most unpromising conditions. This literary output provided a theological and practical framework for future missionaries, emphasizing that cultural hostility was not a sign of God's absence, but an invitation for deeper sacrifice. Paton's later years were also marked by a fierce advocacy for the protection of indigenous peoples. He became a vocal critic of the Kanaka labor trade, a system of forced or deceptive labor recruitment that devastated Pacific Island communities. Using his stature in Britain and Australia, he lobbied governments to intervene against the exploitative practices of traders. This aspect of his work revealed a sophisticated understanding of the intersection between spiritual ministry and social justice. He recognized that one could not preach the peace of Christ while turning a blind eye to the systemic violence inflicted by one's own countrymen. John Paton died in January 1907, leaving behind a legacy that cannot be measured merely by the number of churches built or converts baptized. His life stands as a monumental study in sustained commitment in the face of what appeared to be total failure. The reason behind his endurance lay in a radical reorientation of the self. He did not view his life as his own, but as a vessel for a purpose that transcended his personal comfort and even his personal grief. The method of his success was found in his refusal to compartmentalize his faith. Whether he was navigating the slums of Glasgow, digging a grave on Tanna, or addressing the General Assembly in Edinburgh, Paton operated with a singular focus. He demonstrated that the most effective missionary is not necessarily the one with the most innovative strategy, but the one with the most unbroken resolve. His influence continued through his descendants, most notably his son, Frank Paton, who continued the work in the New Hebrides, and through the thousands of individuals who were stirred to mission by his story. Paton's life serves as a reminder that the most significant harvests often grow from the most painful sowings. In the annals of Christian history, he remains the apostle to the new Hebrides, a man who proved that the fellowship of Christ is a reality capable of sustaining a human soul through the darkest nights of the spirit and the most violent storms of the world. John Paton's life forces us to confront a challenging reality. The greatest successes in our lives often grow from the soil of our most painful failures. As you consider Paton's transition from the morning of Tanna to the harvest of Aniwa, reflect on your own Tanna moments. Are there areas in your life or vocation where you feel you are currently digging a grave for a dream or a hope? Consider that Paton's effectiveness didn't come from avoiding suffering, but from his willingness to be sustained through it. How might a shift in perspective, from seeing obstacles as endings to seeing them as preparations, change your current resolve? The story of John Paton is a testament to the power of a life fully surrendered to a higher calling. If you found this insightful and want to explore more stories of resilience, theological depth, and the pioneers who shaped our world, follow our channel, Theology Today, and learn about the voices that bridge the gap between historic endurance and the living mission of Christianity today.